Okay, we're going to start our viral unit with smallpox. And smallpox is one of the worst diseases ever to hit mankind. It has been very deadly across centuries, across millennia, and only in the last, well, in the 1980s was it ever considered non, not on the, not, what am I trying to say? Well, it was eradicated in 1980. So it has gotten several nicknames: the speckled monster or the red plague. And as you can see from this image, those make sense. So, oops, let go. It has been around forever. It first infected humans around the time that humans started developing agriculture. So before they were hunter-gatherers, and then they started to band into small groups and promoted growth of certain crops in and around their living areas. So that was about 12,000 years ago. We have seen smallpox on lots of different skeletons over time. One of the earliest is Ramses V, who reigned from 1149 to 1145 BC. His mummy was recovered just around the turn of the century, and he suffered and died from smallpox. And you can tell this, or scientists were able to tell, based on the lesions that were on his mummified face. If you were to scroll in on this picture, you can see along his cheek, there's a lot of lesions. You can see a large one on his nose, probably from, without scrolling in. He likely had some on his head as well, his scalp area, and maybe even on his body, but it's considered his face that actually kind of defined the case for scientists. So as I mentioned, it's killed a lot over a long period of time. So there was also a plague of Athens, a plague in Athens called the Plague of Athens in 430 BC. And this pretty much wiped out the city-state of Athens at that time. They were involved in the second year of the Peloponnesian War, and it just, they just really failed during that war, and actually the entire city was pretty much devastated. And then in Rome, the Antonine plague of 165 to 180 that killed between 3 to 7 million people, including the emperor at that time, who was Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest emperors of Rome. And because of this, it hastened the decline of the Roman Empire because there was a lot of loss of people, a lot of loss of troops. Just like we saw with the Justinian plague, when you have a major disease that comes through, it really disrupts society, and that did happen. Now, the Roman Empire still survived at this time, but it did probably contribute to the decline. Smallpox has killed tens to hundreds of millions of people nearly every year over, as I mentioned, eons, centuries, etc. Since 1900, between 1900 and 1980, it killed 300 million just during that time period. Devastating. So the history in the old world, we're talking, the old European and old Asian countries. It killed about 30% of the population as it, spread through those areas, and it was not contained over time. I mean, it didn't rush in like the Black Plague did and kill a bunch of people, but it would come in and kill some. It would spread, and then it would kind of vanish depending on how far the people lived from one another, and that kind of thing. It's a virus, so cold viruses, COVID virus or coronavirus. Viruses spread, but they don't always spread like an epidemic. So that's kind of how smallpox has been throughout the world. But it did kill about 30% of the people in the old world, and blinded and disfigured many others. So, it causes these lesions that you'll see that that can really do some damage to a person. The Americas, and that that's North and South America. The death toll in the early 1500s, 1600s was much worse. They had no exposure to the virus prior to the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors. We're talking about Latin and America and South America. Europeans who conquered those areas had been exposed to smallpox before and either had immunity or, some of them didn't, obviously, but many of them did. But the native populations in North and South and Central America had no exposure whatsoever. So their death rates were extremely high. As I mentioned, it devastated the Incas, or the small South and Central America. So it devastated the Incas and the Aztecs. Hernan Cortez arrived in Mexico in 1519. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru, and just wiped out millions of native populations there. And then when the Europeans arrived in North America, there were lots of settlers from France and Germany and England and, just all over Europe. And they killed massive numbers of Native Americans when they arrived, because they too had no exposure or no immunity to smallpox or any related disease at all. So there was approximately, or scientists estimate, there was a loss of up to 90% of those populations. So can you imagine what this world would be like if those populations had survived? It would be so different. And it's just really tragic that happened. Now, there is some story you might have heard that there was some thought to give Indians infected blankets, and that's pretty much been debunked. I mean, we don't know for sure if it's true or not, but there was some talk of it at one point. But who knows? Who knows? Nobody's alive that was there, but there is no written record of that, as far as I know. Not to say it didn't happen. We're really rotten people sometimes. So here are some smallpox epidemics that have occurred in the United States starting in 1674. There's a Cherokee tribe there. The Cherokees were kind of in the southern United States, Oklahoma area, that kind of place. So that was a large epidemic. And then you can see Boston, New York, Boston again, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, West Coast, Great Lakes. So lots and lots of smallpox epidemics in the United States because, as I mentioned, there was less immunity. Europeans, of course, had more immunity, but their children, et cetera, did not have as much immunity. So, of course, in Europe, it's continuing to spread. It's going to spread in the Americas as well. So it is very contagious. That's one of the hallmarks of it. It's airborne, very contagious. It's disfiguring and very deadly as well. And as I say here, one of the most destructive diseases known to humankind. I mean, if you imagine, as I mentioned earlier, 30% of, Europe, and then 90% of the Americas, that's a lot of devastation. You can see what it looks like here on the left-hand side. Ferdinando de' Medici. He lived in Italy. You've probably heard of the de Medicis. You will if you haven't already, as you continue your education. Anyway, you can see here he has smallpox. That's a before and after painting of him. No photographs at that time. And then on the right-hand side, here's a young man who has a severe case of smallpox. I think this picture was taken around the 1930s. So you can see it does a lot of damage. So the causative agent, or the etiology is, the cause essentially, is a virus called variola major. Okay? And this is the most common type. It is the most severe, and it's 90% of all cases. It has a fatality rate of 30%, and that's in general populations. Probably if there was a non-exposed population, we'd see much higher numbers. But it is very fatal among children, because children just don't have the immune system that we have. There is also a modified form of it, which is much more mild. And this often occurs in people who have been vaccinated. And then there's a flat type of variola major and a hemorrhagic. The flat is rare, but it is severe and fatal, and hemorrhagic is also rare, but also severe and fatal in large numbers. Then there is another one, another variola, which is called variola minor, and it's a much less common presentation of smallpox and much less severe disease. It's much more of a mild disease. And death rates from variola minor are about 1% or less, 0.5%. So most people do recover from that. But variola major is the serious and most common one. So variola belongs to the pox family of viruses. There's a number of pox viruses. And these viruses only infect humans. It is one of the largest viruses. And you can see here, it's kind of I guess maybe a dumbbell shape, if you will, or, kind of a tube bulb end. It is made of a double strand of DNA. A lot of viruses are a single strand of DNA, single strand of RNA, but this one is a double strand of DNA. Here's another image of another poor fellow who has smallpox, a very severe case of smallpox. And you can see he is not doing well, probably. So the illness, the incubation period, or the time between exposure and when you actually get it, is about a week to 2 weeks. The range is 7 to 17 days, but it's usually right around that 2-week mark. It starts in your oral pharynx, then it invades your macrophages, your lymph, spreads to your skin, to your intestines, to your lungs, to your kidneys, and to your brain. Ugh. Not a nice disease. So after exposure, and when you're first starting to get it, you're going to, this is after, let's say day 10 or day 11, you're going to have a prodrome period. And that prodrome means kind of before it happens. You're starting to feel kind of icky, but you don't have the full onset of the disease. So you'll have a high fever, 101 to 104. You'll have flu-like symptoms. You'll have a bad headache. You'll have severe stomach and back pain. You might vomit. And of course, you're going to be tired. Anytime you have a fever this high and you don't feel well, you're going to be tired. So then what breaks out is the early rash. And that on day 1 of the rash, you get red spots on your face and in your mouth. You develop this rash then develops into sores that break open and spread the virus in your mouth and your throat. Your other symptoms are going to continue. So, you're still going to have the fever, the headache, the tiredness, the abdominal pain, the back pain. And then on day 2, the sores in your mouth, they break open. And then the rash starts to appear all over your body. It starts kind of on your face, spreads down to your arms, then to your legs, to your hands, to your feet. After this spreads on day 2, day 3, then your fever is going to fall and you might start to feel a little better. But here's a picture of an early case of smallpox. You can see it on kind of the tongue, and it's probably on the oral pharynx, and then it's going to spread into the throat. And recall, once it leaves the throat, it starts on your face and it just spreads all the way down your body. So on day 3, your rash becomes these raised bumps of what you think of like a pimple. It's called a papule. And then day 4, these bumps fill with a thick, opaque fluid. And they have a depression in the center of them. So kind of like a donut without the hole, but how it kind of has a depression in that. I call it a belly button. And then you start to not feel good again. Your fever goes back up and it remains high until scabs form on these bumps. Okay. The bumps, what do you suppose is in the fluid, or what's the fluid in these bumps? Of course, it's all the things that you're going to use to fight disease with. It's going to be macrophages, and it's going to be fluid that's leaked from your veins and your lymph, etc. So here's a poor little baby who has smallpox on his face, and probably you can see it going down his neck. So it's likely he has it all over his body. So after that is the eruptive stage. So we've gone through a rash, we've gone through the throat, the mouth to the throat to the spread rash, and then they become these pustules. And that's, day 4 or 5 or day 4. And then the lesions fill with this pus. And that takes about another day or two, and then they start to feel hard. So the pus kind of gets hard, and it feels almost like there's a bead or something in your pimple. You know, it's just really hard. And then eventually, these lesions are going to form scabs. And then eventually, after that, the scabs are going to fall off. So that's part of your body's immune system taking care of this. But they do leave scar tissue. So you know, they have created a really robust infection in your skin, in your derm, epidermis and dermis. And so when they fall off, there is still a scar there. And you are contagious to others all during this time until all of your scabs have fallen off. And you're often infective even during the prodrome period, but you're most infective, you know, on days 3 to 5, something like that. So we can see the progression of the rash, or the pustules, if we will. So here we have on the left, we have the 3rd day of the rash, the 5th day of the rash, and you can start to see the kind of belly buttons or the depression in the center. And on the 7th day of the rash, you can definitely see them, and they are now starting to form some scabs. And hopefully this patient survives and gets rid of their smallpox. So the pustular stage, which I just talked about, the pustules begin to form a crust, and then they scab over. And by the end of the 3rd week after the rash has first appeared, most of your scabs will have, or most of your sores will have scabbed over. So 3 weeks, you got those nasty things. And then takes about another 6 days, your scabs are resolving, meaning that they're going to start to fall off. They've gotten hard, they've gotten scabby, and then they're going to fall off. But you are still contagious, as I said, until all of those scabs are completely gone. And they're going to leave marks, as I said, that become pitted scars. Most scabs have fallen off, as I said, 3 weeks, and the person is contagious until all the scabs have fallen off. Okay. So here you can also see another progression of the disease. In the top 3, you can see the pre-eruption phase. So that's the prodrome. This child is probably not feeling well. They might have tested positive for smallpox. And then you can see on day 4, well, you have to kind of look closely, but there are lesions starting to erupt along the belly. And then day 5, you can see them much more pronounced, and they just get worse as we go along. And then you can see days 11 through 14. The second to the right picture on the bottom, you can see some white areas. That's where a few scabs have fallen off. And then you can see on the far right picture, most of the scabs have fallen off. Looks like maybe still 1 or 2 in this picture that have not fallen off yet. So complications, well, obviously pockmarks and scarring. The virus necrotizes your skin, meaning it chomps it up, and it also destroys your sebaceous glands. And your sebaceous glands, as you know, are most prominent on your face, and that's obviously why we get acne. But that's where you're going to get a lot of the scarring, because of the sebaceous glands. You can also have blindness because it scars your cornea. This is rare, but it's not impossible, you know. And it does happen more if you are malnourished or you have an additional infection going on at the same time that you have smallpox. Smallpox can also cause encephalitis. Remember, what's the swelling of the brain and the meninges around the brain. Can cause osteomyelitis, which is infection of the bone. And we saw that with Ramses V. It can also cause stillbirths and spontaneous abortions, miscarriage, and it can cause infertility. If it's in males, it can create it's called azospermia, which means you cannot produce sperm anymore in males. So it infects the testes, and then you cannot produce sperm. And of course, the worst complication of all, which happens in a number of cases, is death. So I don't know if I've told you this, but I absolutely despise viruses. Bacteria we can pretty much cure with antibiotics in most cases. We can have vaccines, but viruses are a different story altogether. We do have some vaccines for viruses, but typically we can't cure them. There have been some recent developments, as you know, for influenza. There are a few antiviral medications you can take, but as a whole, they're just a lousy class of bugs. I don't like them. Maybe one of you will soon develop something that allows us to treat and cure viruses. That would be wonderful. I'll be forever grateful. But until then, I still despise viruses. All right, so we talked about regular variola major, which is smallpox. Then I mentioned there was a couple of different types. So one type is flat, one of the second types is flat variola major. This is more frequent in children. And in this case, the lesions develop very slowly and they kind of coalesce together and they create this kind of suede-like feel to your skin. Velvety is sometimes the way it's also described. They don't really ever progress to the pustular stage. This is highly fatal. It is rare, luckily, and this is commonly seen in those with a deficient immune response. The second type, excuse me, the second type is hemorrhagic variola major, and this occurs in, well, it's rare, but when it does occur, it's not selective. It can be both sexes, adults, children, etc. It is seen just a little more frequently in pregnant women who, as you know, are slightly immunocompromised. Prior vaccination, even with the smallpox vaccine, is not protective in this. Somehow it escapes and is able to still invade us and kill us despite the vaccination. It has a much shorter incubation period and it's more severe in prodrome period. So when you're first starting to feel sick, you get really sick. You have really high fever. You just, you're feeling horrible. And then shortly it progresses to a rash. And then the rash is followed by little micro hemorrhages. You can see in this image the kind of black areas. That's where this rash has actually hemorrhaged, and there's dried blood in that. Luckily, you do die by the 5th or 6th day, and sometimes it's even before these lesions occur and can hemorrhage. It's just a really bad form of the disease. So how do we diagnose these two particular forms? Well, the greatest concentration is typically on the face and your distal extremities, meaning like fingers, toes, feet, hands, that kind of thing. The first lesions are the same as variola major in your oral mucosa, your palate, your face, maybe your forearms. And as I mentioned, the patient appears very sick, toxic, or moribund. And then there's a slow evolution of the rash. However, it's not like variola major where, it takes 2 or 3 days for this and 2 or 3 days for this. Each stage in this case lasts usually only a day or two. And you can also have lesions on the palms or soles of your feet. And in all of these cases, we can ID smallpox via genetic testing. And, there is a slight difference in each of these viruses, these variola viruses. So treatment is mostly supportive care. We can't cure it. So we're basically treating the symptoms, try and reduce your fever so it's not toxic to your brain or any of your other organs, trying to keep you hydrated and nourished so that, your organs can still continue to function while you battle this disease. And in some cases, if you've been exposed to smallpox and you get the virus within the first few days, you can actually reduce the severity of the symptoms. So if we ever have a biological attack of smallpox, we have a huge store of smallpox vaccines that will go to prevent smallpox in people who've not been exposed, but hopefully will also be able to be used for those who were exposed to smallpox to decrease the severity and the potential of death in those people. Antivirals, we're starting to develop some antivirals that work on influenza. They have not been tested on smallpox for obvious reasons. We can't just say, hey, sign up and get smallpox and we'll see if this antiviral works. That would be completely unethical. So if we do ever have smallpox come back, then maybe they can, do some testing then. But until then, we won't know. So prevention, the vaccine is 95% effective. So that's really good, a really good vaccine. And immunity usually lasts 3 or 4 years. And then in the United States, the last vaccine was given in 1972. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated following a worldwide vaccination program. So the last vaccine in the United States was 1972. Between the 1960s and 1980s, or until 1980, so in the 60s and 70s, the World Health Organization decided that this was a disease that they could really conquer with a great deal of effort. So, with funds they had, and then with contributions from some of the richer countries, developed or produced a number of vaccines and introduced a major vaccination campaign throughout the world. And that was quite successful. And so in 1980, we no longer have smallpox on the planet. Although United States and Russia, and who knows if there's any other countries, do have stores of smallpox to be used in biological warfare. Not so happy about that. But also they need them in case, like, let's say United States is not going to use them. Okay, let's just say that. Then if there was some attack or if the virus came back, then they theoretically need those to study it or to produce vaccines or produce, medications and such. So, it's kind of like the nuclear weapons. If both sides have them, then hopefully it's not ever going to be used. So, all right, so let's talk about, we were just talking about vaccination. Well, the first type of vaccination was something called variolation. And variolation is when you used a little speck of actual smallpox from a scab or from the pus, and you used it to, you gave it to somebody who did not already have the disease, a healthy individual, in the hopes of protecting them from the disease. So in the case of variolation with pus, what they would often do is create a small cut, maybe not a really deep cut, but a small superficial cut on your arm or on your leg, and then they would add some of this pus, and then that would cause you to get the disease, but theoretically it would be a much milder case of the disease, and it often was. And then in a couple of weeks, maybe a month, you would be completely recovered, and you would then have immunity from the worst of the disease. There were occasionally people who died, but they would have died anyway if they had gotten smallpox. So, not to say it's a good thing, but at least some people were saved. Another method, as you can see on the left here, this was originated, in ancient China. And in this case, the doctor, healer, would grind up some of the scabs into a small dust. And then they would use, in this case, it looks like a long straw, but some kind of an instrument to blow some of this dried scab into a healthy individual. And in doing so, they too would get exposed to smallpox and develop a mild disease, and then be protected from smallpox thereafter. And on the right is something from the Mideast, Ottoman Empire, I'm guessing. And we can see they're doing the same type of thing. On the right is a fellow walking in who has smallpox, doesn't look real happy to be there, if you ask me. And then I think the doctor is seated in the red garb, and he is about to variolate the person sitting on the couch or the sofa or the chair there. So they're going to use a little bit of, or he is going to use a little bit of the pustule, the pus or whatever from the sick patient to variolate the other one. So I've got well, let me go start here. So Cotton Mather was a good guy and a bad guy, it's kind of like all of us, although I think he was a little more on the bad side. But anyway, Cotton Mather was one who was promoted the Salem witch trials, so that's a demerit on his side. And then he was also a slave owner, so that's a demerit. But he did listen to one of his slaves. He had a slave named Onesimus, and in 1721, Boston started having a pandemic of smallpox. And so Onesimus said that he had had a treatment, an operation or something that had made him immune to smallpox. So he described this to Cotton Mather. And basically, it was the variolation of, the scratch on the skin, injecting a little bit of the pus. So Cotton Mather was really promoting this as a way to prevent people from getting sick. But it wasn't a real popular theory. And so when he was in his medical office and working with some people trying to develop this, and a grenade was thrown in when they were sleeping. He was not killed, but and I don't know how many of the people in there were killed or injured. I just know that he was not killed. But he still went on with promoting this particular process. And I have an article attached that I'd like you to read, because Onesimus he's another hero, in our American history. Very little recognized, but let's do it. All right, you might remember Edward Jenner, who had the medical practice in Gloucestershire, England. That's where I'm from, my ancestors. Anyway, you might remember also he noted that milkmaids didn't get the huge scarring from smallpox, and his reasoning was that they actually had cowpox, which gave them protection from smallpox, and he was right. So he took some a small amount of matter from the cowpox pustule from the hand of Sarah Nelms, and then he used it on, this is the hand of Sarah Nelms. This is actually his drawing, obviously a photo of it, but this is the hand and arm of Sarah Nelms. You can see a few little pustules there, and obviously she's a milkmaid, so her hands are going to be the part that's exposed. And so she gets some lesions on her hands, and Edward Jenner uses a little bit of pus from that, and then he injected some of the cowpox pus into one of his patients, a little boy by the name of James Phipps. And James developed a scab. He had some soreness in his joints and muscle aches, and he had a mild fever for about a day. And then 6 weeks later, wait a minute, I've got this weird. 6 weeks later, he didn't inoculate young James. The inoculated young James actually had no signs of the disease. He had recovered. Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense. But then Jenner published his findings, and he named this procedure vaccination. And that was because vacca is Latin for cow. So it's still used today. Thank you, Mr. Jenner. And vaccination soon replaced variolation. So that was the actual injection of the cowpox pus, and it was purified or whatever, titrated and just a small amount used. But in 1853, after Jenner had died, many years after he had died, vaccination became standard practice for smallpox, and then eventually for many, many, many other diseases as we know today. So here's Mr. Phipps and Dr. Jenner. Mom's carefully holding James's hand, or James's arm, to keep him steady. These are the actual tools that Dr. Jenner used. There's a museum in his honor, and that is, one of his little surgical instruments, I suppose, or maybe what he used for bloodletting, because that was common way back, a little bit in his time. But anyway, and this is his medical suite or medical office, scientific office. This is where he did vaccinations on people at his estate, a little home, a little cottage, I guess, out in the back. And then this was his cottage, and guess what? He left it to James Phipps upon his death. So the sign on the brick there says, "This cottage was left to James Phipps by Dr. Edward Jenner in recognition of him having been the first person that Dr. Jenner vaccinated against smallpox." So good old James Phipps, good for him and good for Dr. Jenner. I love that. All right, so smallpox, very bad, very bad, very bad. But the last known case was in Somalia in 1977. Another great guy. Ali Ma'alin was the last person to have naturally acquired smallpox. He was a cook at a hospital at a healthcare facility, and he did some, some healthcare, not skilled, but, some. And October 12th, 1977, he rode in a vehicle with two smallpox patients, taking them to get help, and get them restored to health. And he did get smallpox from those two people, but he recovered. This is him, and you can see his body has some scars on it from smallpox. And that was in 1977. And as I mentioned, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated from the planet in 1980. He was the last known natural case. Some sad news about Ma'alin. After recovery, this is good. He dedicated his life to eliminating polio. He became a polio vaccinator. He organized volunteers and he knocked on doors and he tried to convince people that it was safe. And here's a quote from him. Now, when I meet parents who refuse to give their children the polio vaccine, I tell them my story. I tell them how important these polio vaccines are. I tell them not to do something foolish like me, meaning don't get them and then get smallpox, and in this case, polio. So Somalia was declared polio free in 2007. Now, polio still exists worldwide, but it's much less common, and that may be one of the next vaccination campaigns of the World Health Organization. All right, so sadly, in 2012, polio came back, and Mr. Ma'alin went back to work and started organizing another immunization campaign. Here's another quote from him. Somalia was the last country with smallpox. I wanted to help ensure that we would not be the last place with polio too. However, here's the bad news. On the second day of the campaign, Ma'alin got sick. He died of malaria. And we've learned about malaria and how bad that can be. So anyway, a wonderful guy, and something we owe a lot of debt to. All right, so here are some other notable smallpox victims. So first, I'll mention Queen Elizabeth I. Many of you know she painted her face, or had, used kind of a white makeup, and that was, she applied it very heavily, and it was due to her smallpox scarring. She tried very hard to cover her smallpox scars. Louis XV of France, Mozart, Beethoven, these people, Louis XV, I believe, died of smallpox, but Mozart and Beethoven did not. Another one I didn't mention was Mary Shelley, who wrote Dracula or Frankenstein. Can't remember now. Frankenstein, I think. Yeah, Frankenstein. And also Abraham Lincoln had smallpox. It was really played down because, he was the president of the United States, and that's what they do. But he did have a decent case. And he didn't die from it, so that was good. Another one, Joseph Stalin, you might know him, the dictator. He got it around the age 6 or 7, and he had some really bad scarring. He had all his photos retouched because he didn't like his scars. And some say that his brutality was because of his scarring. He got bullied for that, and then he just became, an evil person. Geeta Bali, she was a Bollywood star in, I think it was the 30s through the 50s. She was one of the greatest stars of Bollywood, and unfortunately, she got smallpox too and died. So we've lost a lot of wonderful people, and a lot of wonderful people have gotten smallpox. And anyway, we don't want it to come back. All right. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. We're going to be talking about SARS.